Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my full review of the Canon RF-S 18-45mm f4.5 to 6.3, the standard kit zoom for EOS R mirrorless cameras with cropped APS-C sensors. Originally launched in May 2022, this little lens costs around $300 or pounds by itself, but can work out as little as $100 or pounds when bought in a kit with one of Canon's bodies. Now, I made a brief video about it when it first came out, but I decided to fully retest it 2 years later against Sigma's first RF mount lens, the 18-50 f2.8. The Sigma lens is a higher end option with a brighter and constant f2.8 aperture, typically costing around $600 or £480. I've made a separate video all about that lens, and it's definitely the one to go for if you own one of Canon's higher end APS-C bodies like the EOS R7. But if your budget is tighter, or you prefer the smallest and lightest zoom to match an equally compact body, then the RF-S 18-45 could be right for you. Plus, as Canon's standard kit zoom for its more affordable bodies, there's a lot of them out there, so it's worth seeing what it can and can't do. The RF-S 18-45 is certainly very compact, measuring 60mm wide at the mount, before tapering a little for the main barrel. It's a retracting design that's only 45mm long in its shortest state, extending by roughly 28mm when set to its widest focal length. Here's the Canon zoom on the left against the Sigma on the right, both in their shortest configurations as you'd typically transport them. And note, my Canon sample here was fitted with an optional filter, which is adding a few more millimeters to its length. The RF-S 18-45 is also very light, weighing a mere 130 grams thanks to its modest and variable aperture of f4.5 to 6.3. Meanwhile, Sigma's 18-50 at 296 grams can't exactly be described as being heavy, but it is still over double the weight of the Canon, which you'll barely notice when it's mounted on a body. It makes smaller models like the R50 and R100 look and feel particularly compact. As you've seen, a twist of the zoom ring extends the barrel for use, and as you zoom through the range, the barrel dips back in a little bit before extending out again. Now, it's not unusual for a budget kit zoom to do this, but like many cheaper lenses, I did notice the image shifting a little bit on the Canon when zooming. Here's a video I filmed with the 18-45 showing its 29 to 72mm equivalent range, but also that small image shift as the barrel wobbles a little. Now, this isn't going to be a problem when taking photos, but it can be a bit distracting when filming a zoom for video. This is something that the Sigma lens avoids. Positioned alongside the zoom ring is a free spinning manual focusing ring, which can be reconfigured by the camera's body to operate as a custom control ring if preferred. At the end of the barrel is a 49mm filter thread and a bayonet for mounting the optional EW53 hood, which is going to cost you an extra $30 or so. Meanwhile, like most budget lenses, the mount is plastic and lacks any weather sealing, in contrast to the metal mount and rubber grommet of the Sigma, which is also supplied with a lens hood. Okay, now for focusing, starting with the Canon RF-S 18-45 at 45mm, where its maximum aperture is just f6.3. It's very swift at pulling focus here, although there's less of a challenge thanks to the greater depth of field. And now in continuous servo AF for much the same performance, and like the Sigma, is operating in silence. Notice the AF coverage across the entire frame though on the R7 versus the Sigma, which operates in a slightly reduced area. Okay, now let's try for video, starting with the RF-S 18-45 at 45.6.3, where you'll see the camera and lens quickly refocus when pointed at the background, but sometimes pause for a moment when the bottle becomes the subject again. This seems to be how the EOS R7's video autofocusing responds under these conditions, but at least the focus pulls are smooth, confident, and again quiet. Let's now give it a moving target, starting with the RF-S 18-45 again at 45.6.3, where you'll get an idea of the depth of field effects that are possible for a portrait. Now at 6.3 there's unsurprisingly minimal blurring behind me, but at least the face and eye detection are easily keeping me focused. How about at the wide end of the range? Here you can see the Canon at 18mm f4.5, that's the maximum aperture at 18mm, which includes much more of my surroundings, but again minimal opportunity for blurred backgrounds at this aperture. I'll be looking at the potential for shallow depth of field effects more later in the video. But first, a quick focus breathing test, starting with the Canon at 18mm, focusing from infinity to the closest distance and back again, where you'll see a mild reduction in the field of view. And now for the Canon lens at 45mm, where you'll see the field of view reduce more noticeably as I focus closer, as if the lens were being zoomed in. Breathing is less apparent on the Sigma at both ends of its zoom range. Next, for stabilization, as a key benefit of the Canon lens over the Sigma is the presence of optical image stabilization, providing compensation for Canon's many bodies without IBIS. In fact, at the time I made this review, only the R7 supported IBIS in the APS-C range. Canon quotes 4 stops of compensation for bodies without IBIS, and when I tested it on the R7, where the lens IS works alongside that body's IBIS, I was able to handhold 0.8 seconds at 45mm. This works out at about 5.5 stops of compensation over my unstabilized result on that day. Next, for movie stabilization, tested on the R7 at 45mm, starting without any stabilization where the view is obviously wobbly. Now for the Canon lens with stabilization enabled, so here you're looking at IBIS in the body working alongside optical IS in the lens. There's no way to separate them. Next, here's additional digital movie IS applied using the standard setting, which takes a small crop. Note it's not possible to also disable IBIS on the R7 here, so you're looking at IBIS plus digital with additional optical IS. And finally, with digital movie IS set to enhanced, where the crop is more substantial in return for potentially better stabilization. Now for my optical quality tests, and here I've used the default lens aberration settings in the camera menus, so that means peripheral illumination correction is enabled, while distortion correction is greyed out, which means it's always being applied for this lens. So here's my distant real-life landscape scene, angled as always so details run into the corners, and I'm starting with the Canon RF-S 18-45 at 18mm 4.5, again the maximum aperture at the wide end. Let's zoom in for a closer look in the middle of the frame, where I'm focused, and there's already a good degree of detail. Stopping down to f5.6 brings improvements to the contrast, but there's no additional benefit beyond this in the middle in terms of sharpness. Returning to the f4.5 sample and heading into the corners sees the image soften a little and become a bit darker due to vignetting. Closing the aperture to f5.6 improves both aspects, and at f8 you can enjoy additional sharpness in the far corners. Next for the lens, roughly midway through its range at 30mm, where the maximum aperture becomes f5.6. Taking a close look in the middle again shows a decent amount of detail and no issues to report. Closing the aperture to f8 makes little to no difference in the middle here. So back to f5.6 before heading into the corners, where you'll see the finest details becoming a little softer in the extremes. Closing the aperture to f8 brings minor benefits to sharpness and contrast here. And now for the lens at its longest 45mm focal length, where the aperture dims even further to f6.3. Taking a closer look in the middle of the frame again shows good detail at this aperture, with little to no benefit to stopping down any further. Moving out into the corners of the f6.3 sample reveals some softness, although as with the shorter focal lengths, this is mostly concentrated in the very extreme corners. It's actually not too bad if you look a little closer into the frame. Meanwhile, closing the aperture a little to f8 improves the corners a tad, but you're not going to get fully sharp results in the extremes. If you're interested in how the Sigma 18-50 compares, do check out my separate review of it for a more detailed report, but just briefly, both lenses actually look pretty similar in the middle when set to the same apertures, but the Sigma was noticeably sharper in the corners as both were zoomed in, even at its larger apertures. Okay, now for my portrait test with the RF-S 18-45 at 45-6.3 again, the maximum aperture at this end of the range. As you saw earlier on my video example, there's minimal potential for background blurring at this kind of distance, but if you take a close look in the middle, the details on my face are at least sharp. For comparison, here's the Canon on the left and the Sigma on the right at 50mm 2.8, showing the difference that a brighter aperture and slightly longer focal length can make to shallow depth of field effects. But if you're really chasing background blur, consider going for an even brighter prime lens like a Canon 50mm 1.8, or maybe even Sigma's 56 1.4. To check out the potential for bokeh balls, here's the RF-S 18-45 again at 45-6.3, this time from its closest focusing distance. Here the blobs are fairly small, as you'd expect from the modest aperture, while also taking on an elongated shape towards the edges. As I close the aperture, they may become more rounded, but of course gradually become even smaller too, making this lens unsuitable for the bokeh and blurring fans out there. For comparison, here's the Canon on the left and the Sigma 18-50 on the right, again at their longest focal lengths, maximum apertures, and from their closest focusing distances. As you can see, the Sigma will deliver far larger bokeh blobs with its f2.8 aperture, although again you'll enjoy even more with a 50mm 1.8. And for completeness, here's the Canon and Sigma lenses again, but this time at their widest focal lengths of 18mm, so that's f4.5 for the Canon on the left and 2.8 for the Sigma on the right. and my final test is for macro performance, where I've simply photographed a ruler as close as I could with both lenses at their longest focal lengths and also at their maximum apertures. So 45mm 6.3 for the Canon at the top and 50mm 2.8 for the Sigma at the bottom. Here the two lenses are delivering 96 and 82mm across their frames, so the Sigma is capable of slightly greater magnification, but the more important difference here is how crisp it looks at the edges even at 2.8 versus the Canon at 6.3. Sadly, closing the aperture on the Canon isn't going to improve the edges at the long end of the range. And now it's time for my final verdict, during which I'll show you some photos taken with the Canon RF-S 18-45 on a Canon EOS R7 body. Canon's RF-S 18-45 delivers a basic zoom range with a modest aperture in a compact barrel. It's reasonably sharp in the middle and only softens in the very extreme corners. Optical stabilization also gives you around 4 stops of compensation for bodies without IBIS, or around 5 for those that do have IBIS. It's also impressively compact and light, weighing just 130 grams, and folding down to 44mm in length, making it an ideal partner for Canon's smaller bodies. But there's no getting away from the modest aperture, which fails to deliver any more background blur than a typical phone camera. It's also a little galling to look back at Canon's previous kit zoom for EOS M, which started wider at 15mm 3.5 despite being much the same size and weight. And while the even older EF-S 18-55 for DSLRs may share the same 18mm wide angle as the new RF-S kit zoom, that older lens reached a little further without dimming beyond f5.6. So this latest RF-S kit zoom has not only the shortest range, but also the dimmest aperture of these three lenses, which can hardly be described as progress. Indeed, my advice when reviewing those older lenses is even more relevant today. If you're after substantial background blur for portraits or close-ups, just get yourself a cheap standard prime like a Canon 50mm 1.8. And if you can afford the Sigma 18-50 2.8 from day one, I'd strongly recommend going for it instead. But like earlier kit zooms, the RF-S 18-45 isn't trying to win any quality awards. It's just aiming to be the smallest, lightest and most affordable option, designed for their smallest, lightest and most affordable bodies. I don't think many people are going to buy it separately, but if it only adds around $100 or pounds to the price of a new body, I'd say it's worth getting, even if only as a starter or a spare lens, or to enhance the body's resale value. Ultimately, for the target market, I'd say it's fine, but that doesn't mean that all APS-C lenses should be basic. There are many of us who have no intention of upgrading to full frame and would simply like some more aspirational lenses that are designed for cropped sensor bodies. Thankfully, Sigma is bringing its full range of DCDN lenses to the Canon RF mount, but I'm sure we'd also all love to see some from Canon too. How about it? And that's it for this review. I hope you found it useful. And again, if you're looking for a more upmarket general purpose zoom for your APS-C body, do check out my reviews of the Sigma 18-50 2.8, including one specifically for the Canon owners out there. Thanks for watching. Sorry for my slightly hoarse voice, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.